The sun beat down on the dusty main street of Willow Creek, burning the air into a shimmering haze that made the world seem crueler than it already was. In the center of the square, tied to a weathered post with coarse hemp rope that bit into her wrists, stood Clara Bennett. The once cream fabric of her dress hung in tatters, streaked with dirt and the dull brown of dried blood. Stray strands of her chestnut hair clung to the sweat on her cheeks, framing eyes that refused to bow, even under the weight of every stare fixed upon her. The townsfolk had gathered, merchants in their aprons, mothers holding children at the edge of the crowd, grim-faced men with their thumbs hooked into gun belts, all watching with the same mixture of disgust and smug righteousness. They had already tried her without trial, and the verdict had been handed down in whispers and nods. She was guilty, not of theft or murder, but of something far worse in their eyes. Loving Jesse Colton, the outlaw whose name had been spat like a curse for the past year. The bank robbery in Red Rock had painted a target on his back, and though those who knew him swore he was incapable of such cruelty, the sheriff's wanted posters made no room for innocence. Clara knew the truth. Jesse's hands were rough from ranch work, not from violence, and the eyes she'd looked into on long summer evenings held no malice. But the town did not care about truth. They cared about keeping their hands clean by casting someone else into the dirt. The first crack of the whip split the hot air, snapping against her back with a sting so sharp she had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from crying out. Another followed, and the crowd's murmurs grew louder, emboldened by her silence. They called her names that clung to the air like flies over a carcass. Traitor, whore, outlaw's bitch. She kept her gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the sheriff's office, where the road stretched out toward the open plains. In her heart, a single thread of hope held her upright. Jesse had promised he would come back for her, and she believed him as surely as she believed the sun would set tonight. But each lash made that belief harder to hold. Each jeer chipped at the memory of his voice. When the whip was raised again, the motion caught in her peripheral vision, the sunlight flashing along the braided leather as it arced toward her skin. She braced for the burn, but instead another sound cut through the air, low and steady at first, then pounding, growing louder with each heartbeat, the rhythmic thud of hooves on hard-packed earth. Heads turned toward the sound. A few men shaded their eyes. The sheriff frowned, his grip tightening on the handle of the whip, and then they saw him, riding out of the heat shimmer on a black stallion, dust spiraling in his wake, his hat pulled low, and his eyes locked on the woman at the post. The murmurs died. A ripple of something, maybe fear, passed through the crowd. Jesse Colton was coming home, and with him, the storm. The sting of the whip seemed to pull Clara's mind backward, pulling her away from the heat of the square and into a day far gentler, though the road to it had been long worn with hardship. She was 17 then, walking with her father along the trail toward town after a heavy spring rain had left the ground thick and stubborn. Their wagon's back wheel had sunk deep into a patch of mud near the creek, the mule stamping impatiently while her father cursed under his breath. They had been out since dawn, bringing barrels of dried beans from their small farm to trade at Miller's General Store. Clara remembered stepping into the mud herself, trying to shove at the wheel, her boots filling with cold water, when she heard another voice, a low drawl that seemed both amused and concerned. "Looks like you could use another pair of hands," the stranger had said. He was tall, his hat pulled low enough that she couldn't quite see the color of his eyes, but his hands, steady, capable, were soon at the wheel beside her father's. In minutes, the wagon lurched free, the wheels splattering mud against all three of them. She laughed then, a startled, embarrassed sound that made the stranger's mouth tilt in the faintest of smiles. "Name's Jesse," he told her father, tipping his hat before walking his horse toward town. It was only later, when they saw him again outside the blacksmith's, that Clara caught his eyes properly, deep-set and the color of storm clouds, and felt something quiet settle in her chest, a warmth she could not name. Back then, he was just a ranch hand passing through, and no one in town knew his name except her. Weeks later, that would change. The second time they met was not by accident, though Clara only admitted that to herself much later. She had gone to the market for flour and molasses, but she lingered by the corral where the ranch hands brought their horses to be shoed. Jesse was there, speaking low to the blacksmith, the sunlight turning the dust around them into gold. He noticed her before she could look away, and when he walked toward her, his steps unhurried, she felt her pulse quicken in a way that made her both nervous and alive. They spoke of nothing and everything: weather, the stubbornness of mules, the best way to cure a saddle sore. Yet Clara found herself smiling more than she had in years. Over the summer, their paths crossed often. At the well in the mornings, on the trail to the Bennett farm, once even at the church social, where they danced exactly one song before her father's disapproving glare drove Jesse back to the shadows. The trouble began not with Jesse, but with his brother, Caleb. Caleb rode with a rough crowd, men who spent their nights drinking in saloons and their mornings avoiding the law. When a bank in Red Rock was robbed and the sheriff's deputy swore he'd seen a Colton among the riders, suspicion fell easily on Jesse, though no one could prove he'd been there. It didn't matter. In a place like Willow Creek, a man's blood could damn him faster than his deeds. Clara's father forbade her from seeing Jesse again, warning her that an outlaw's name would ruin her. She obeyed in front of him, but inside, she knew she would not let go so easily. By autumn, Jesse had stopped coming to town. Some said he had gone north to work the cattle drives, others claimed he was hiding in the hills. Clara heard nothing until the night she left a small bundle of food behind the old cottonwood tree on the ridge road. It was a risk, but she had overheard two drifters mention a lone rider camping near there. For weeks she kept it up, leaving bread, jerky, and sometimes a note she dared not sign. One night, as she set the bundle down, a voice from the shadows said her name. She turned, and Jesse stepped forward, leaner than she remembered, the hollows of his cheeks shaded by stubble, but his eyes as steady as ever. They spoke in hurried whispers, his hands holding hers as if afraid she'd vanish. He told her he couldn't stay. Caleb's gang was restless, and the sheriff was itching to pin the robbery on him, but he promised he'd come back when the dust settled. They stood there under the cottonwood, the chill of the wind threading through her hair, and she said she would wait. Neither of them knew a pair of eyes watched from the ridge above. By morning, the rumor was everywhere. Clara Bennett was feeding the outlaw. In a town like Willow Creek, that was enough. The sheriff arrived at their door before sunrise, and by noon she was dragged to the square. They called it punishment for aiding fugitive. She called it the price of love. And as the next lash tore at her back, she clung to the memory of Jesse's voice under the cottonwood, promising to return. The heat pressed down on the square like a heavy hand, but the sound that rose from beyond Main Street cut through it. Hoofbeats, not the lazy trot of a rancher coming in from the range, but the hard, urgent rhythm of a man who had pushed his horse past the point of comfort. Every head turned toward the sound. The sheriff squinted into the sunlight, a frown tugging at his mouth. Clara, half conscious from pain and the oppressive glare, forced her eyes open, her heart slamming against her ribs. The dust cloud drew nearer, and then he was there, Jesse, astride a black stallion whose coat gleamed despite the dust, his shoulders broad and rigid under a worn leather coat. His hat was pulled low, but Clara could see the steel in his eyes from where she stood tied to the post. The murmurs in the crowd swelled into a low roar. "It's him! It's the outlaw!" someone hissed. Jesse didn't slow as he reached the edge of the square, pulling the reins so sharply the stallion reared, hooves slicing the air. The sheriff's hand drifted toward his holster, but Jesse's gaze fixed on Clara and never wavered. He swung down from the saddle, the dust of the trail clinging to him like a second skin, and began walking toward her. The crowd parted instinctively, uncertain whether to fear him or admire the sheer audacity of a man walking into the noose with his head high. "Stay where you are, Colton,"
the sheriff called, his voice strained but loud enough to carry. Several deputies shifted in place, their hands tightening around their rifles. Jesse ignored them. He reached the space just beyond Clara, where the post's shadow fell across his boots, and only then did he let his eyes flick toward the sheriff. "She's my wife," he said. The words were simple, unadorned, but they rang through the square like a church bell. A hush fell over the crowd, broken only by the restless stamping of Jesse's horse behind him. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked. "A man like you, keeping something like that quiet?" Jesse shrugged, the motion slow, deliberate. "Didn't seem the town's business. But the law here says a man can take his wife from the square if she's being punished for his crime. That right?" His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was a weight to it that made even the loudest gossips fall silent. The sheriff glanced at the preacher, at the shopkeepers lining the edge of the crowd. No one spoke, but the truth of it hung there. By the town's own code, if Jesse claimed her, they couldn't stop him without breaking their own rules. Clara's breath caught, her mind spinning. She had never been his wife, not in any church or under any law she knew, but the way he stood there claiming her before everyone who had spat on her name made something fierce and bright burn in her chest. The sheriff took a step forward. "If that's so, you'd best prove it," he said, testing Jesse's nerve. Jesse didn't flinch. He reached into his coat, not for the gun still holstered at his hip, but for a small, worn strip of leather. It was a bracelet, simple but crafted with care, the kind Clara had once made for him the summer they met, braiding it from the reins of her first horse. He held it up, turning it so the sunlight caught the worn initials carved into it. CB, small but unmistakable. "He made this for me," Jesse said, his voice quieter now, meant for Clara as much as for the sheriff. Something in the sheriff's face shifted, and he spat in the dust. "Take her and get out of my town," he growled, but his hand stayed close to his gun, ready for trouble. Jesse stepped forward, pulling a knife from his boot to cut the ropes binding Clara's wrists. She stumbled, the weakness in her legs almost buckling her, but his arm came around her waist steady and unyielding. Without looking at the crowd, he shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders, shielding the torn fabric of her dress from their stares. Then he turned, guiding her toward the waiting stallion. The whispers started again, some awed, some angry, but no one moved to stop them. Not yet.
Jesse didn't waste a breath once they reached the stallion. He swung into the saddle in one fluid motion, then leaned down and pulled Clara up in front of him, her body light but trembling in his arms. The crowd instinctively stepped back as the stallion pawed at the dust, and Jesse gave the reins a sharp flick. The horse lunged forward, and in seconds they were clear of the square, the shouts behind them swelling like an angry tide. Clara clutched at Jesse's arm, the leather of his coat rough under her fingers, and dared a glance over her shoulder. The sheriff was barking orders, and a few men were scrambling for their own mounts. The gunfire came next, a sharp crack that split the air, a bullet kicking dust up just inches from the stallion's hooves. Jesse bent low, his voice in her ear, calm but edged with urgency. "Hold on, don't look back." They tore down the main road, past weathered storefronts and half-watching bystanders, until the buildings thinned and the open country swallowed them. Behind them, the pounding of hooves grew louder, 3, maybe 4 riders giving chase. Jesse guided the stallion toward a narrow trail that veered off into the scrub hills, the path winding between boulders bleached pale by years of sun. It was a trail no one from town would take unless they knew every twist. Jesse had ridden it 100 times. The stallion's muscles bunched and stretched beneath them, steady despite the punishing pace. Clara could hear the breath whistling between its teeth, the creak of the saddle, Jesse's heartbeat drumming hard against her back. One more sharp turn, a rise between 2 jagged rocks, and they were gone from the rider's sight. They didn't stop until the sound of pursuit had faded completely into the hum of cicadas. Jessie slowed the stallion to a trot, then to a walk, guiding it down a narrow incline toward the glint of water. The creek lay hidden in a fold of land, shaded by cottonwoods whose leaves whispered in the hot breeze. He swung down first, then lifted Clara gently, his hands lingering at her waist as her feet touched the ground. She swayed, the adrenaline gone now, leaving only pain and exhaustion in its place. Without a word, he led her to the water's edge, kneeling beside her and cupping water in his palms to let her drink. The coolness shocked her throat, but it was the warmth in his eyes that made her chest ache. He pulled a clean rag from his saddlebag, dampened it, and began wiping the dried blood from her wrists, his touch careful, almost reverent. "Why did you come back?" she asked, her voice raw. "You could have kept running. You could have been safe." Jesse's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away from her wounds. "Safe's no good if I know you're standing in that square alone, taking their hate because of me." She blinked hard, but the tears still came, slipping down her cheeks in silence. When he finished, he set the rag aside, his thumb brushing one tear away. "I told you once I'd come back. Didn't matter how many guns they had pointed at me." The creek's gentle murmur filled the quiet between them. In that moment, with the heat pressing down and the dust of the chase still clinging to them, the world felt suspended, just the two of them, alive and together, for however long the trail ahead would allow. By nightfall, the horizon ahead glowed faintly, a seam of orange fading into indigo. Jesse guided the stallion through the last stretch of scrubland, each hoofbeat a little slower now, the long day's ride wearing on both horse and riders. Clara's head rested against his chest, the steady thump of his heart her only anchor after hours of silence, broken only by the creak of leather and the sigh of the wind. When the dark silhouette of a cabin took shape against the fading light, Jesse's shoulders eased for the first time since they'd fled the square. The place looked abandoned, shutters hanging crooked, weeds choking the path to the porch. But there was wood in the shed, and the walls still stood. He swung down, helped Clara dismount, and together they stepped into the dim interior. Dust motes danced in the beam of moonlight spilling through a crack in the wall. Jesse moved with quiet efficiency, lighting a lamp, shaking out an old blanket for Clara to sit on. "I stayed here a while, years back," he said, his voice low. "Figured it'd still be standing." Clara ran her hands over the rough wool of the blanket, the smell of dry pine and cold air filling her lungs. For the first time that day, she felt the smallest flicker of safety. Jesse knelt beside her, pulling a battered tin box from under a loose floorboard. Inside were a few coins, a knife, and a folded packet of papers. "These," he said, tapping the papers, "prove I wasn't anywhere near that bank the day it was robbed. Witness statements. One from a marshal who owed me a favor, but they'll do no good unless I bring them in myself." Clara met his gaze, her voice firm despite the ache in her body. "Then we'll go together." The night passed in fits of uneasy sleep, the shadows deep and heavy around the cabin. At dawn, Clara stepped out onto the porch, Jesse's coat draped around her shoulders. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain, and the first light spilled like gold across the hills. She could hear Jesse moving inside, the sound of him loading supplies into the saddlebag. When he stepped out, his hat brim low against the rising sun, he reached for her hand without hesitation. "It won't be easy," he said, his thumb tracing the inside of her wrist where the rope burns had begun to fade. "They'll fight to keep the truth buried." Clara looked toward the road, the dirt track winding away into the wide unknown, and tightened her fingers around his. "Then we'll ride through it," she said. They stood there a moment longer, the world stretching open before them, and for the first time since that terrible afternoon in the square, she felt no fear. The stallion waited at the edge of the clearing, head bent as it cropped the grass, patient and ready. Jessie gave her a half-smile, a silent promise that whatever came next, they'd face it side by side. And together they stepped down from the porch into the morning light, their shadows long behind them, their future unwritten, but theirs to claim. Somewhere far behind lay the town's jeers and the crack of the whip. Ahead lay a road where love, stubborn and unyielding, could outrun even the harshest judgment.